SriLankan Airlines expects passenger traffic to surpass pre-pandemic levels by year-end during its peak travel period. And that's thanks to a boom in tourism. Sri Lanka's economic crisis culminated in its bankruptcy last year. Still, its flag carrier managed to break even for the first time last year. The airline even intends to ramp up frequencies across its network as it adds 10 newly leased aircraft to its fleet. CNA's Roland Lim is covering the IATA annual meeting and World Air Transport Summit, and he joins us live now from Istanbul. Roland, you caught up with Richard Nuttall, the CEO of SriLankan Airlines. He says the carrier looks set to go back into the green going forward. Tell us more about that.
Yes, Richard really firmly believes that the worst is over for the airline and is also putting on a brave face simply because of the growing positive passenger yields. Now, because the passenger numbers have actually risen, that's helped the airline come back into the black for the first time in 10 years and is just as positive about the outlook for this fiscal year as well. So I spoke to him and this is what he had to say.
I think the outlook for next year is even stronger. So, I mean, if you look at the year we've just had, the year started with the economic challenges in the country, in Sri Lanka. We had travel advisories. And then in July and August, the country ran out of jet fuel. So I've never worked for an airline with no jet fuel in its home country before. So everything had to take stop in India. We lost payloads. So even with all of those headwinds, we still broke even. So assuming that the world stays the same for the year ahead, which we expect, and the Sri Lankan economy is rebounding, tourism is coming back, we're forecasting perhaps a 50 million profit next year.
So you had a double whammy of COVID and a financial crisis in the country. How did that affect you in terms of trying to manage, operationally speaking?
We started to return from COVID in December 21. December 21 was probably one of the most profitable months we'd ever had, and that continued through January, February and March. And the traffic was coming back. There was a bit of a hiccup with Omicron in the January, but the first quarter of last year, of the calendar year, was profitable. And then we had the problems in the country, so it was like going through the whole thing again. But if you look where we are now, tourism is now back where it was the first quarter of last year. Is coming back.
So the country is mulling over trying to attract Chinese tourists back to the island. Does Sri Lanka Airlines play a part in this promotional effort?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at promoting tourism to the country, we have the tourism authority and you have events that people go to. But day in, day out, we have sales teams on the ground in all the countries that we fly to, and they work with all the tour operators. So, at a working level, day in, day out, we're promoting the country. I've worked for 8 airlines. I don't think I've ever worked for an airline that probably spends so much time promoting the country rather than the airline itself.
The $3 billion bailout from the IMF for the country, it's still trying to reach a debt restructuring agreement. Are economic conditions affecting your business?
The economic conditions were challenging right at the start of last year because there were just not dollars in the country. So you bring $100 into the country and then you'd need to spend some money, and the bank would say, well, you can only have 80 back. But we sort of got through that by sort of September, October last year. The currency devalued. That's been a challenge for many people in the country, but actually for the airline it doesn't really matter because in practice 80% of our revenues come from overseas, come from outside the country, and actually even in the country the underlying fares are set in dollars. So we are somewhat protected against currency moves. I think the thing that has surprised us though is, and maybe this is on the back of COVID, but fares everywhere are really high. But if you're in Sri Lanka and your currency is devalued by 70%, airfares have gone up, they've doubled or trebled. They've not gone up 30% like the rest of the world, but people have been still buying tickets.
Did the fuel shortage that you mentioned earlier on the island, did that hinder the airline's operations in any way? Is the worst over?
So that's all under control, but so I guess there were 2 levels. First of all, for about a month, the country was very short of diesel and petrol in the country, and so we would spend, every second day begging to get a Bowser of diesel, because otherwise the risk was that the airport operation would stop, because we have all the ground vehicles and you need all of those to keep things going. We also had times when we had to run 24-hour shifts at the airport because there wasn't enough fuel to get people to and from work. But the really interesting one was when we ran out of jet fuel in July and August. But what I would have to say is that we were asked the question in April, what happens if the country runs out of jet fuel? And we sort of scratched our heads and thought, well, maybe we can fly 30%. But actually what happened was they ran out gradually, and the civil aviation managed supply, and so they asked everybody, well, take 75%, take 60%. And so we started doing tech stops. We also worked with the Indian authorities, and I think so by the time we actually ran out of fuel, we'd learned quite a lot about what we could do, what we couldn't do, and how best to handle it.
What are your plans to restructure at the moment? Any solutions to servicing your debt levels?
At the moment, the country is looking at how to handle state-owned enterprises, and there is an initiative, partly through the IMF and partly because that's the philosophy of the government itself, that the government should not be, shall we say, guaranteeing or paying for state-owned enterprises that are inefficient. So they want to take away their liability for that. So that perhaps means privatizing, but in the first instance it just means repairing balance sheets. So if you look at us this year, 10% of our revenue has gone in paying interest on past debt that has really nothing to do with the airline of today. We've not had any money from the government for 2 years. But we've got interest rates on dollars that we're paying between 12 and 15%. And that is long-term unsustainable when passenger yields come down.
Privatization efforts you mentioned, have there been any offers?
So in Sri Lanka it goes through a process. So there is a unit called the State-Owned Enterprise Restructuring Unit that's been set up under the Finance Ministry, and they are looking at the privatization process, not just for the airline, but for a number of state-owned enterprises. And they're looking at Sri Lankan as a part of that. But it will go through a process, and I mean, we're not managing it, the government's managing it, but we expect at some time in the process that they will ask for expressions of interest. And then we'll see, do we get a good partner that works? Maybe, maybe not.
So it does sound like Richard has his work cut out for him with the restructuring of the airline's balance sheet, as well as restoring its fleet, as well as routes. But after making drastic operational cuts, the biggest challenge still remains servicing the airline's debt levels. And if the government can help to bring in more favorable terms, well, then the airline can possibly stay in the green longer in the air. Back to you, Dawn.
All right, Roland, thank you very much for that. CNA's Roland Lim there live for us at IATA's annual meeting and the World Air Transport Summit in Istanbul.